To keep things simple, ACES stands for Academy Color Encoding System. Without getting too far into the weeds, most monitors will display in sRGB or Rec. 709. What you need to know about color for digital art that you consume on a monitor or a phone or whatever else is that there's two things. There's your gamma, which is the values between 100% white and 100% black, and your gamut, and that is the amount of color that a display can display, so then you can watch the video in color. Now, the best way I found to describe working in the ACES color space is a sandwich. The bottom piece of bread is our inputs, our input device transform, or our IDT. We basically take our CG footage and our raw footage and we have to convert it into an ACES color space, or at least say we want this to be a sandwich. So we have our IDT and then we have to do our color grade, our post effects. These are our ingredients. So we can do anything we want with this sandwich. We can add some curves, we can add some lumetri color, we can add some lens flares, some post effects, etc., etc. And the benefit about working in the ACES color space is because of the wide gamma and gamut of ACES, you have more dynamic range and more flexibility in post to handle all of your creative inputs. The value about working with ACES is that it can be significantly more creative because you get more flexibility in post. Now, the problem is with this ingredient and IDT, we still need to convert it for our monitor so then we can view it in its final destination. Let's say that's Rec. 709 for a TV or a monitor, which might be sRGB. We have to say, hey, we need to transform this final footage into our final destination color space, our ODT, our output device transform. So we say, hey, we see IDT taking raw, going into the ACES color space. We say we understand ACES with the ODT, and we finally package it up as Rec. 709, and we can finally consume said piece of content or consume our sandwich, and love the fact that we were able to work in the ACES color space and have more flexibility and be able to make any kind of sandwich we want. And the last thing that I want you to know about ACES is dynamic range. Now, what does that mean? In layman's terms, it basically means the ability to see values between black and white. More dynamic range, or a greater number of dynamic range stops, will allow you to see more values between black and white. So let's put it in camera terms just to have some sort of foundation for this concept. The Arri Alexa, which is generally regarded as the best camera for cinematography, filmmaking, all that fun stuff, it has about 15 stops of dynamic range, if I recall correctly. The Sony a7S III that I'm shooting on, according to Gerald Undone on YouTube, has about 13 stops. And the human eye has 21 stops of dynamic range. So when you step outside and you look at a beautiful, bright, sunny day, you'll be able to see some of the details in the shadows and the highlights because our eyes can perceive that. Generally speaking, a camera cannot. Now, the fortunate part of dynamic range and ACES is that it allows 3D CG renders to have significantly more dynamic range. And I'm going to demonstrate this with this effect right here, the Frisch Lift out of focus effect in After Effects. Now, if you apply this effect in between your ACES transform and your footage, then you get a beautiful looking result with the bokeh here. But if you apply that same effect on top of all of your layers, then you end up getting a very different and, if I may say, less pleasing result. So understanding the order of operations for ACES will help you make more informed decisions. So if you work in something like Redshift, or Blender or Cinema 4D or Octane and you work in an ACES color space, you can get more values between black and white, and this will make your image look better. Now, how do you actually work with this technically in the software? Well, you can do this in two places. One, Adobe After Effects, or two, Vinci Resolve. Now you might be wondering, can you do this in Adobe Premiere? As of July 2022, no. I mean, there's some crazy weird workarounds. I don't recommend it, and maybe Adobe will come out with a workflow one day, but for right now, After Effects or Vinci Resolve. With that out of the way, let's talk about how to do this in Adobe After Effects. So at this point, we're getting ready to go into After Effects, but first, there is a couple things we have to do to prepare After Effects for ACES. The first thing is that ACES is not a clean workflow for After Effects, so you need an external plugin. Fortunately, everything is free, so here we have the place where you can download said plugin. So what you're going to do is you're going to navigate to your desired computer type. I use Windows, so we're going to click on the Windows, and it's going to download the OpenColor.io plugin. We're going to click that, and depending on how you have your computer set up, you want to extract this into your plugins folder. So you'll go to Extract to in WinRAR, which is what I'm using, but really just depends on whatever extractor you like to use for your computer. And it seems that my history does not have the After Effects directory, so we're going to find that. And the way we find that is we go to this PC and your main drive, typically your C drive. We go to Program Files, Adobe After Effects, Support Files, Plugins. We can just drop it right in there. Don't need to be too fancy. Put that there. Might ask you if you would like to do that, and I would like to say yes, let's do that. And if we then navigate to that folder, we can see that we have the plugin OpenColor.io right there. So that's what we want. We want the OpenColor.io in the plugins folder. Next, what we need to do is we need to download the OCIO config files. And basically this is saying how ACES will interpret that data. So fortunately, there is a GitHub link. All of this will be in the description down below, and you can download right here. When you click that button, it will start the download, and I highly recommend putting this folder somewhere where you can access it regularly. So let's do the same thing. We'll take this folder and extract to, and for the sake of this tutorial, I will put it on my desktop. I do not recommend putting things on your desktop because things can get lost. So we'll just throw that there. And then if we navigate to our desktop, I could just show you my desktop, but I'm on my other monitor. We can just see OCIO config. I only have just one thing on my desktop now, is the OCIO config stuff. And we can see this config folder right here, or rather this OCIO file. That's what we want. So now we can go to After Effects and prepare something for ACES. After we install the OCIO plugin and then we have the config file on our computer in some place, we can now go to After Effects. So now that we're in After Effects, we have to do a couple things to get us started. So the first thing we have to do is click on the 32 BPC right here, and we have to basically tell After Effects to not do anything with the color space. So typically speaking, your working space by default will be Rec 709 or sRGB. We want this set to none. So make sure that's set to none and check blend colors using 1.0 gamma. Once that's done, then what you want to do is you want to go to your footage You're going to right click on it and reveal layer source in project. And I'm going to right click on that in our project bin and interpret footage main. Go to color management, and I want to make sure the preserve RGB is checked. Do this for all of the footage that you want to be converting into ACES. So once that's done, click OK. You'll hold Control Alt and C, and then select the rest of your footage, Control Alt and V. So now what we can do is we can start working in ACES, because After Effects is doing no color management. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and we'll call this slog3 to ACES, and we'll go to our effects and presets. We'll look up Open Color IO, drop that onto this new adjustment layer. Now on this configuration, you're going to go to Custom, and you're going to look up that config file that you saved on your computer. I put mine in my desktop, so I'll just go to that right there. ACES 1.2 config. There we go. We know that this was shot on a Sony a7S III, so we're going to go to Input, Sony S-Log3 Gamut 3 Cine. Now if you're shooting live action footage, you have to know what picture profile your footage was shot on. That is very important. Now your footage looks gross, but then we're going to output this to ACES. We want this to be in an ACES color space. Now, depending on what you're doing, I recommend either using ACES CCT or ACES CG. So first we'll try ACES CCT, because this is what most tutorials recommend. Then what we're going to do is we're going to select that adjustment layer, and we're going to hit Control D. We're going to duplicate it, and then we're going to change everything. So we're just going to reset everything on the new adjustment layer that we just made, this top one. So just hit reset, and we'll call this ACES to Rec 709. Same thing, go to that config file that you just loaded up, and we know that we converted this to ACES CCT, and we want this to be in Rec 709. And there we go. That looks like something that you would normally get when you are trying to do a LUT conversion. It looks normal. It looks like something that you just shot on a camera. And what's really cool about this is we can drag in another clip, let's say this close-up clip, and it'll apply the same thing to everything below. So that's cool. That's helpful. Let's try one more. Drop that on. Hey, look, it's my face. Now, one thing I will add, let's delete these two really quick, is that the order in which you apply effects will change the look of your shot. So, just for fun, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to ACES CG. So the output space of the middle adjustment layer, I'm going to set this to ACES CG. And now it looks gross, but let's go back to that top one, set it to ACES CG, and it looks the same. It looks pretty much back to normal. Now the reason why I did this is there's an effect I wanted to show you. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new adjustment layer, hold Control Alt and Y on our keyboard. We'll call this Effects. And the reason why I'm excited about ACES as a motion designer is that there are some effects that just look better when you work in an ACES color space. So I will go to my effects and presets, and I'll type in FL out of focus. And I got this tip from Botched Creative, link in the description down below. When you work in an ACES color space, you get significantly more color information. So when you crank the blur of this effect, it's going to give you a very pleasing look. It looks like this camera was shot out of focus. You get those beautiful little bokeh balls. It's just a cool looking effect. Now this is a paid plugin, so there is some money that needed to be had to get this effect, but this could apply to other things such as color grading or filters or blurs or whatever else. Now, what happens if I take this effect and I put it on top of this ACES conversion? It looks less good. It doesn't look bad, but it looks less good. And that is why I'm excited about ACES and After Effects, not because of a color grading standpoint, but because we can get a different look out of some of the effects. The last thing I'll demonstrate is one of my favorite plugins. First, let's save, Control S to save early and save often. And we will look up Optical Glow. Drop that onto the effects. And it looks very dreamy and hazy, versus if I put this on top, it kind of washes out and makes everything look really gross. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the workflow in After Effects looks really good, but it's a little bit of a pain. But you can do it. So here's the workflow in After Effects. I hope this is helpful. And what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to demonstrate to you what some CG rendered footage from Cinema 4D looks like. So to get to that point, let's input some footage. I am going to navigate to my pre-renders folder for this tutorial. I have this spot that I worked on for one of my clients, Ultra Pro, and we had some dice floating in the air. Let's drag this in, scale it up, and it looks pretty washed out and gross. First off, let's right click on it. Again, interpret footage, main, color management, and make sure that your preserve RGB is checked. Then what we're going to do is the same thing with those adjustment layers. Control Alt Y on our keyboard. We'll add the OpenColor.io file. Look for that config. Now, when I rendered this in Cinema 4D, I knew I rendered this in ACES. So instead of trying to convert from an input like a log profile such as airy or red, I know that this is ACES CG. And then I know that my output space is Rec. 709. And from there we get a lot more detail in the highlights and the shadow, and it looks really good. It looks like it looked in Cinema 4D. We'll talk about how to get there from Cinema in another video, but the benefit about this workflow, name your layers by the way, so we'll call this ACES to Rec. 709. If we make a new adjustment layer and we add an exposure and drop that on, and we bring this exposure up, notice the waveform on the lower right hand corner here. When we crank these values, it really has a nice fall off. It's not as if we're losing a lot of detail when we go in either direction when we're working in the ACES profile. And that's because of our effect sandwich. We have our footage that was in an ACES color space, and if I solo this, it looks gross. But then we have this final conversion, our top bun, that is saying, hey, go from ACES to Rec. 709, something that is pleasing to the eye. And then everything in between is our creative controls. Now, if I were to crank this up to say like 2.44 and drag this above, it dramatically ruins the footage. So the order of operations for ACES is very important, and the biggest thing about After Effects is that you have to turn off your color management all over the place in After Effects. It's painful, but it can work, and I hope this After Effects workflow helps you. So unfortunately, the workflow for Adobe After Effects is painful. It requires plugins, it requires a lot of extra know-how, it's steps, and sometimes it's confusing. And when you're working with a lot of shots, let's say a full short film or even a major feature, whatever else, working with a lot of footage all at once would be very cumbersome. Let's be frank, I do short commercials for Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, etc. So After Effects works very well for me because I'm only dealing with a couple of shots. And that does not mean you need to switch to DaVinci Resolve. And in fact, there's a lot of plugins that I use in Adobe After Effects that benefit from ACES, such as Frish Lift Out of Focus, or Optical Glow, or things like that. Now, when it comes to working with a lot of shots in ACES, my best recommendation is to work with DaVinci Resolve. And the reason why is because you can batch a lot of the interpretation of this footage a lot easier. And it's an editing piece of software, so you can do all of your editing stuff there. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the workflow in DaVinci Resolve. Alright, so we're kicking off in DaVinci Resolve, and the first thing we need to talk about is your project settings. So go down to the little cogwheel in the lower right hand corner, and we're going to navigate to our color management. Now here we're going to set our color science to ACES CCT, ACES version 1.3 or 1.2. I have the 1.2 config file, and I have not noticed a difference between 1.2 and 1.3, but let's just use 1.3 for now. For the input transform, we're going to apply no input transform because we want to control that on a clip by clip basis. So nothing here, and the output is going to be Rec 709. So that's super easy. Your default will probably be DaVinci YRGB, but just click on the color science, ACES CCT. Click save. You'll probably have to click save, but because we made no changes, I will just hit cancel. So now I have all this footage on a timeline from a variety of sources, and the reason why DaVinci is the industry standard for color grading is it allows you to batch process color management across the board. So I have some footage from an Arri Alexa camera, then I have some Sony a7S III footage. I even have a little logo animation that is rendered in Rec 709, and then some CG footage as well. And I want to show you how to handle all of this. And this is why I'm using DaVinci most of the time for the ACES stuff, but for individual clips, I will use After Effects. So let's start off with the Arri Alexa footage. I will find this in my bin, and then I will select all of those clips, right click, and very conveniently, there is an ACES input transform right here. We can find Arri Alexa, set that, and hey, the clips look so much better. So next we have the Sony a7S III footage. Same thing, what we're going to do is we're going to find all of these in their respective bins, and we're going to set the input device transform. So first, let's go to our a7S III test footage, select all of this stuff, right click, ACES input transform, Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut Cine. Boop. Now I realize that some of this footage is not in its correct folder, so we'll just have to navigate to the corresponding folders. So we'll go here, select all of these, same deal, ACES input transform, Sony, bam. So now all of our Sony footage, between this little clip of the stuff on my desk to the Halo Master Chief toy and this footage of myself in Goldfield, California in a junkyard just because it was cool. And this all looks normal. And then what we could do at this point is move into the color grading process, which we won't dive super deep into, but obviously this shot is underexposed. So from here, after we set all of those footage input device transforms, we can go to our color page and we can crank things up on a clip basis. We could just bring up the offset, and that fixes that clip. And we can go across the board and do our color grades very, very easily, working in the ACES color space. And if we observe the behavior of the Lumetri scopes in the lower right hand corner, we can see it has a very interesting sort of behavior. Really, when we bring down these curves, we can preserve a lot of detail when we bring things down. versus if we were to do this after the fact, it would really crunch it down when we're outside of the ACES color space. Now, let's say hypothetically, you're working with some footage that is not rendered in ACES, or you're trying to get clips from online and you don't really know what you're working with. So let's just say like something you render out of After Effects. This is a particular scenario where we need to understand where we are rendering from After Effects. Now I know when I rendered this from After Effects, I know that this was either sRGB or Rec 709. So we have to select that clip in our bin. Same thing, ACES input transform, and instead of a camera profile, we're looking for invert display. Now, depending on the footage and you don't know, a good starting place is to try Rec 709. And hey, that looks pretty natural. You could also try sRGB, and they'll look relatively similar. Now, because this is After Effects, I am going to work with sRGB because this was working with some standard stuff. But if you define the output color space in After Effects, which we'll talk about in another video, then you can say, hey, this is the color space I want to render in. So then when you work in DaVinci Resolve, then you can get that control. Now, what about 3D renders and CG footage? Well, we can see that this dice clip looks real gross and real weird. And we can tell because this red dye is just really oversaturated. It just doesn't look very, very good. So the way we're going to fix this is we'll go to the CG footage and we will right click on that, ACES input transform, color space conversion, and ACES CG. And just like that, we are now in the ACES color space and we're getting a lot more detail on this dice and everything else for that matter. Same thing with this blood rune clip, ACES input transform, and ACES CG. And then now when we jump over to the color page, we can very easily bring up the shadows or highlights and preserve that detail because we are working in the ACES color space. And we're not going to overexpose nearly as easily as opposed to if we were to do all of our color transforms or color grades after the ACES workflow. So DaVinci Resolve is a very, very powerful tool, and if you're new to it, stay tuned for more videos on my YouTube channel talking about the intricacies of color grading with CG and ACES footage. For now, this should be enough to get you started to work in ACES. So obviously this tutorial and breakdown is skipping a lot of steps, such as how to render in ACES or how to handle footage in ACES. We're going to talk about that in a future video, but I want to leave you with a couple of tips, tricks, and things I've learned over obsessing about ACES. The first thing I want you to know is that I've spent months trying to figure out whether this was going to improve the look of my footage or not. And in reality, it does nothing to improve the exposure or the lighting of my shots, whether it be live action or CG. The most important thing is that you correct your content in camera as much as possible. Now let's assume that your lighting and your composition and your storytelling is all on point, and that means yes, ACES can help if you're doing some final little extra bits of color grading, you're really getting into the nitty-gritty of your project and you want to bring it out in the best way possible. ACES can help with that. But again, go back to the first point. If your content does not look good, ACES won't fix that. But despite ACES not being able to fix a terrible shot, it can make your renders look better if you know how to use it. And when it comes to a quick workflow for trying to create content fast with a lot of content, a lot of footage, this actually has helped me a lot because I'm working on vlogs, I'm working on new tutorials and whatnot, and it allows me to just be like, all right, S-Log3, ACES, Rec 709, done. Super easy, super fast for me, and I found it has been helping me dial in my workflow a little bit more so then I can hopefully create more content for my clients and my YouTube channel whenever I get around to it. So That's ACES. I hope this tutorial, this WTF is ACES breakdown, demonstrates to you the overall pipeline and how to think about ACES. And then in the next videos, we'll talk about how to render in Redshift and ACES, and even how to render in Unreal Engine 5 and ACES. But until then, I will leave you with one final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you'll make some gains. Goodbye, my friends. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. Hit that subscribe button if you would like to join the party, and hit that like button if this was valuable to you. Eat your protein. Take care. Bye.